Good morning. The Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing titled The Impact of International Technology Transfer on American Research and Development. You'll find in front of you packets containing our witness panel's written testimony, their biographies, and their truth and testimony disclosures. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone. I welcome you to today's hearing that, again, is entitled The Impact of International Technology Transfer on American Research and Development. I want to thank our witnesses for being here and for being so flexible. This hearing was originally scheduled back in September, but because of a last-minute member briefing regarding Benghazi incident, we were forced to postpone this hearing. Ironically, as we speak, there's another briefing on Benghazi going on right now as well. But we will move ahead. I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused any of you, particularly to our witnesses and members, and I thank all of you for your understanding. This hearing was difficult to organize for other reasons as well. Many potential witnesses expressed apprehension about appearing before this committee to testify on this topic out of fear of retribution against their business interests by foreign countries. While they expressed serious concerns to us in private about the tactics of many foreign countries when it comes to technology transfer, they worried that speaking out publicly about those tactics would adversely affect them in those foreign markets. This is unfortunate because today's hearing addresses a topic of great concern to this committee: innovation and U.S. competitiveness, particularly in international markets. While the U.S. invests significant taxpayer resources in public as well as in private sector research and development, other nations remain dedicated to acquiring the fruits of our labor. Their efforts to acquire U.S. technology have clearly had a significant impact on U.S. trade, our GDP, and the U.S.'s standing as a world leader in research, development, and innovation. Unfortunately, measuring that impact has proven very difficult. Last year, the U.S. taxpayer spent roughly $130 billion on research and development, and U.S. companies and universities spent another $310 billion. This doesn't even take into account the impacts of tax incentives that total over $8 billion. Determining who ultimately benefits from these investments should be something that government as well as private sector entities are able to track. Our concerns are not limited to economic espionage and theft, even though this is clearly a significant threat. This subcommittee has been active in ensuring that federal agencies under our jurisdiction are prepared for cyber attacks and insider threats that seek to steal sensitive and proprietary information. We're here today to discuss something different, but just as troubling: the policies and practices of foreign countries that facilitate the transfer of U.S. technology and intellectual property overseas. This happens in many ways, sometimes through domestic manufacturing requirements, sometimes through standards certification, and sometimes through conditions of foreign investment. These policies, among others, allow countries to exploit our R&D investments without making the commensurate investments themselves. Oftentimes, U.S. companies allow this transfer to take place because they are faced with a very difficult choice. In today's global marketplace, companies need access to the largest markets in order to compete. Sometimes, companies are faced with the difficult decision to either file for bankruptcy or agree to detrimental financing terms, such as transferring their intellectual property in order to receive additional investment. It was reported just last week that a company, A123, a U.S. company that has received $124 million of its $249 million grant from the Obama administration, this to develop battery technology for electric cars, would file for bankruptcy. As part of that bankruptcy, A123 planned to sell its business to a U.S.-based company, Johnson Controls, for $125 million. But other bidders are able to make better offers at an upcoming auction that I understand is going to happen tomorrow. China's Wangshan Group Corporation has already expressed interest in procuring A123 and making it entirely possible that the U.S. taxpayers' investment in A123 will be shipped off to China. This is just the most recent case. Several other companies that received significant support from U.S. taxpayers, like Evergreen Solar, were faced with making difficult decisions, very similar to this, in order to remain viable. Time and time again, we have seen U.S. R&D investments, particularly in sectors that receive favorable treatment from the current administration, like wind, solar, and batteries, simply be sent overseas. It's a dirty secret that nobody wants to talk about. Not the government agencies that fund the R&D, not the companies that receive the R&D, not the associations that represent the companies, and certainly not the foreign countries that benefit from our R&D investments. Investments, I should add, that ultimately came from money that we borrowed from China in the first place. I want to be clear, this is not just about China. This is not just about green technology. It's happening across the board. This also isn't about the value of public or private sector R&D, which everyone realizes is important for economic competitiveness. Our goal is to better understand the magnitude of the international technology transfer, ensure that someone is monitoring these issues, and identify measures to ensure that U.S. investments are realized by U.S. interest. Now I recognize the ranking member, my good friend from New York, Mr. Tonko, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. American citizens have a huge stake in what American firms do with their innovations. The federal government is a key driver of innovation through federal research laboratories and its substantial support of research through grants and contracts. In fiscal year 2012, the federal government appropriated over $140 billion for research and development. American firms also receive support for innovation through the widely used research and experimentation tax credits. For 20 years, this tax credit has effectively subsidized research by private firms, and by 2011, it represented approximately $10 billion a year in savings to companies. This credit obviously needs to be extended. Finally, a whole web of public supports ranging from state budget appropriations to Bayh-Dole Act protections for intellectual property through to student loans and education tax credits have created an engine of innovation that drives our economic success in this ideas economy. The central engine of innovation remains the American university. Our universities lead the world in producing high-quality science and engineering students, and they provide a home for researchers who work at the cutting edge of their fields to supply the basic ingredients for continued innovation. These interconnected public investments have helped make the United States one of the most innovative economies in the history of the world, with American firms leading in almost every area. The American people provide this support out of a belief that innovation will ensure that our economy remains strong in the long run. They also believe that American firms that reap the lion's share of these supports will indeed share the fruits of these innovations with our society in the form of jobs for hardworking Americans. When firms instead license that technology abroad, whether as part of a strategy to build access to foreign markets or because they wish to move production to lower wage markets, the American taxpayer finds that the bargain they made to support those firms is not as rosy as had been promised. It is no secret that it is faster and cheaper to adopt technologies than it is to develop them. It comes as no surprise that with the development of a global marketplace, the intense competition for market share, and the movement to a more open and integrated world economy, governments have turned to policies that will enable their firms to exploit the innovations of others. I am indeed uncomfortable with the idea that American firms license away innovations subsidized by our citizens. It is bad enough that we have lost jobs when firms offshore production and move out of our communities. The idea that they would exchange taxpayer-supported innovations for market access, however reluctantly, is very disturbing to me. Stating opposition to the practice of foreign governments adopting policies that bar American firms from doing business in those countries absent a local partner and absent a technology sharing agreement is, quite honestly, easy. Finding a solution is much more complicated. We cannot abandon our investments in education and research, but our citizens have the right to expect and require, I would note, a return on those investments. I do not have a policy answer ready to address these concerns, but I am very interested in hearing the thoughts of the witnesses today as you are invited to appear before us. And I thank you again, Mr. Chair, for convening this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. It's really nice that we're both on the same page and making sure our taxpayers get a proper return from their investment in these companies. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Dr. Robert D. Atkinson, President of Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and the Honorable Dennis Shea, Chairman of U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. I thank y'all for y'all's patience and willingness to have the flexibility to be here today. Now, as our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee will each have 5 minutes to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. And it is the practice of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight to receive testimony under oath. Do either of you have any objection of taking an oath?
No, sir. No.
Both. Let the record reflect that both stated no, so that's great, instead of shaking their head from side to side. You also may be represented by counsel. Do either of you have any counsel with you here today?
I have a couple of very able staffers with me, but I don't know if they rise to the level of counsel.
Okay, legal counsel is what we're discussing here. So let the record reflect that that none of the witnesses have counsel. Now, if y'all would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear and affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses participating have taken the oath of truthfulness. Now I recognize our first witness, Dr. Atkinson. If you would, sir, turn on your microphone. You have 5 minutes. We're not going to gavel you down at 5. If you take a few seconds over, but if you would, we have votes a little after 11, so we want to get to questions as quickly as we can. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Tonko. I appreciate the invitation to appear before you today. This is a critical issue that you're facing and discussing today. Many nations are looking to get as much technology, knowledge, and innovation from other countries who are leaders, like the United States and like Europe, and they're looking to get it in inappropriate ways as a way to advance their own economy. We mentioned China. China's not the only one, but they're the most egregious. For example, in 2011, the Chinese government committed to, quote, place the strengthening of indigenous innovation capability at the core of economic restructuring. Indigenous innovation refers to enhancing original innovation, integrated innovation, and re-innovation based on assimilation and absorption of imported technology. What that really means in English is they're going to do everything they can to take as much technology from people who develop it and get it into their economy and into their firms. Some of these policies that countries use are quite legitimate. Countries and firms in other countries buy technology, they license it. They have policies like R&D tax credits to spur their own innovation. In fact, we now have the 27th least generous R&D tax credit in the world. But many of these policies are illegitimate and they violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the WTO. And let me just go through a few of them. We've already talked about some. IP theft. Industrial espionage is up, according to the FBI and according to national security experts. You see high-profile cases recently, like the Chinese stealing chemical secrets from DuPont, stealing wireless telecom secrets from Motorola, and stealing and bribing employees and stealing from an American company called American Superconductor, which is one of the largest provider of wind turbine software in the world. We also see, again, you alluded to this, Mr. Chairman, state-owned or state-backed companies who will buy U.S. companies. I think this is going to be an increasing trend. Again, it's one thing for a private company in another country to come in and buy a company. Our companies do the same. But it's very different when a company comes in to bid on a U.S. company where they're backed by the state. They have deep pockets, and many of these, particularly in China, are either state-owned or state-backed, and they have an unfair advantage when it comes to buying and bidding for U.S. companies. So we've really got to do a better job, particularly in CFIUS and other areas like that. Another area is weak IP protection. Many of these countries intentionally have weak IP regimes. Even if they look strong on paper, they're weak in enforcement. We see this, for example, in data exclusivity in biopharmaceutical firms. We have a 12-year data exclusivity period in the United States because of Congress, and this is about the minimum seen as the time that companies need to be able to recoup their investments in this highly risky technology. Many countries are trying to weaken that and have very limited data exclusivity policies for biotechnology. I think the most troubling area and the widest area is basically limiting market access to tech transfer. It's hard for a small country to do that with just a few million people because multinationals will say, we don't really care about your market, we'll just bypass you. But big countries like Brazil, India, China, they have essentially a monopsony. They have so much market power, they basically can force foreign companies to these unfair extortionist practices, and they do that. China is a good example. In China, it's virtually impossible for a foreign company to go in there and just open up a factory or an office. We can do that here. Foreign companies come here all the time. They can open up here. In China, they require joint ventures. Another area is compulsory licensing. Countries that just simply say, we think we want your technology. If you want to sell it here, you have to do a compulsory license, as we see that particularly in drugs. And finally, indigenous, including in procurement, where the government itself says we're not going to buy products unless the company transfers the technology to our country. So what should we do about this? I think there's, first of all, the most important thing we can do about it is exactly what you're doing, which is we need to raise the issue. I simply don't think enough policymakers are aware of this, enough people in the media are aware of the significance of the problem. But the second thing we need to do is we do need to just be much more active in enforcement. And I know there is a budget crisis, but I think a few $1 million more at USTR would be money very, very well spent. We spend at least 100 if not more times defending our national security through the Defense Department than we do defending our economic security through USTR. USTR is just simply under-resourced to be able to bring the kinds of cases and the pressures that they need to do. The second area I think is critical is we can't solve this problem on our own. We have to do it with our allies, particularly with Europe. And I would suggest two things. One is we've got to develop a strategy where European and American governments actively join arms and say to countries like China and Brazil and India that we're just not going to accept this anymore. Another area I think to consider there, I know I'm slightly over and I'll just stop, is I think we need to think about joint antitrust exemption. We did this in 1984 with an antitrust exemption for collaborative R&D for U.S. companies. I think we need to give companies the tools to say together, if they're all in the chemical industry, for example, or the aerospace industry, we're going to agree that we're not going to transfer technology to these countries under duress. If we want to do it on our own, that's one thing, but we're not going to do it under duress. That way they can't get played off against one another. And finally, we need to make sure that any trade agreements we sign, including the bilateral investment treaty that's being negotiated with China right now, are really gold standard agreements. I think we put way too much pressure on either this administration or the last or any administration just to sign agreements. Get an agreement, get an agreement. A bad agreement is not as good, is worse than a no agreement. We need good agreements. We need gold standard agreements. We need to do that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. We need to do it with the China BIT Agreement. And we need to basically say to any administration, again, regardless of party, you need to negotiate trade agreements, but they need to be gold standard agreements that protect U.S. interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Atkinson. Mr. Shea, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today. I will share some of the Commission's findings, but the views I present today are my own. Technology transfer is just one part of a multifaceted strategy by the Chinese government to move China's economy to a higher position on the value-added, high-technology industrial chain and to develop a culture of innovation. The Commission addresses many of the broader issues in China's innovation strategy in our 2012 report to Congress, which was released in mid-November. Today, I will focus my testimony on Chinese government efforts intended to transfer technology from the U.S. and other developed nations to China and Chinese companies. Let me say at the outset that China has made no secret of its ambition to shift its economy from one dependent on manufacturing products invented elsewhere to one that produces products whose intellectual property originated in China. One of China's key central government planning documents, the 2006 Medium to Long-Term Plan for the Development of Science and Technology, describes 402 technologies in which China seeks to gain expertise, and it calls for China to limit its dependence on foreign technology to just 30% by the year 2020. The 12th five-year plan, another Chinese central government plan for economic development, which was adopted last year, identifies 7 strategic emerging industries in which Chinese corporations are expected to become global champions. These industries include clean energy technology, biotechnology, and next-generation information technology. To help achieve its technology goals, China frequently adopts policies of tech transfer as a condition for foreign firms, 1, to gain access to Chinese markets in certain industries, 2, to be considered for procurement by the Chinese government, and 3, to benefit from Chinese subsidies and tax benefits. Depending on the industrial sector, the Chinese government requires many foreign companies, as Dr. Atkinson mentioned, to enter into joint ventures with Chinese firms in order to enter the Chinese market. The Chinese companies often requiring their foreign partners to transfer technology as a precondition for the establishment of the joint venture. Additionally, Chinese law requires government approval of foreign joint venture agreements. Paragraph 7.3 of China's Protocol of Accession to the World Trade Organization prohibits China from conditioning the approval of investment by foreign companies on the transfer of technology. But China claims that it is not violating WTO prohibitions because the actions taken by foreign companies are purely business decisions. This argument has been seriously questioned by the U.S. government and business groups. Here's what the USTR said earlier this year, and I quote, "Although China has revised many of its laws and regulations to conform to its WTO commitments, some of these measures continue to raise WTO concerns, including those that encourage technology transfers to China without formally requiring them. U.S. companies remain concerned that this encouragement in practice can amount to a requirement, particularly in light of the high degree of discretion provided to Chinese government officials when reviewing investment applications." My written testimony goes into greater detail about the dilemma that U.S. companies face when considering whether to transfer technology in China. However, I do want to note that some 300 U.S. businesses surveyed by the American Chamber of Commerce in China last year, 1 in 3 acknowledged that either they or their clients have been negatively impacted by forced technology transfer. As Dr. Atkinson mentioned, forced technology transfer also occurs through the Chinese government procurement policies. Although China agreed in 2001 to accede as soon as possible to the voluntary WTO agreement on government procurement, that has not yet occurred. Without the constraints of the GPA, the Chinese government has introduced restrictive procurement laws. In 2009, Beijing required companies to file applications to be considered for accreditation as indigenous innovation products eligible for procurement. President Hu Jintao came to the United States and said, we're repealing this policy. The policy looks like it's been repealed at the central government level, but the message hasn't gotten to all the provinces, which have huge procurement markets as well. So this is an issue that needs continuing monitoring by the federal government. Another issue is the issue of patents. The impetus to register local patents is also being reinforced by the rising number of utility model patents issued in China. While such patents are used throughout the world, they are subject to less rigorous and expensive review processes in China. Utility model patent holders in China can act as patent trolls, using patents as a ploy to either exclude foreign competitors or to justify intellectual property theft. As companies continue to transfer technology to China, many will face increased competition and pressure from Chinese firms. They may even find that they are excluded from a large part of China's market that they had hoped to gain access to, and that they would have access to if trade with China adhered to international norms. Instead of the reciprocal trade relationship that we should have with a WTO partner, China's conditioning access to their markets on the transfer of technology results in the loss of American jobs and harms the American economy. 2 points, as I mentioned in my, I'll wrap up, but as I mentioned in my written testimony, I don't believe reciprocity is a bad word. Maybe we ought to be demanding some reciprocity in this relationship. And secondly, I agree with the point, the importance of putting pressure on China on a multilateral basis. Let's work with the Europeans, the Japanese, and other partners to deal forcefully with these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shea. I thank you all for your testimony. Reminding members the committee rules limit questions to 5 minutes each. The chair at this point will open the first round of questions. Now the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Atkinson mentioned that China often requires that U.S. companies create R&D facilities in China as a condition of market access. How does creation of an R&D facility lead to the transfer of R&D investments in intellectual property? I asked both of you all that question. Maybe we'll start with Mr. Shea, and then we'll come to Dr. Atkinson, since you started off the...
Well, I would say when 20 years ago, I think Western companies would happily transfer technology because the technology wasn't that advanced. But as production cycles have gotten much shorter, the Chinese know that they're not willing to accept just the old stuff. They know what's out there and what's new. So it's hard to say with respect to a specific facility. Western companies go to China. From what they have told us, they put in significant protocols to protect that IP in that facility from theft. Whether it works or not is subject to question.
Dr. Atkinson.
So when I was in Nanjing about a year and a half ago on a delegation, and we visited a Ford Motor Company facility there, where first of all Ford had opened a factory, which again by Chinese rules they had to do a joint venture. And as a condition of the joint venture, they had to open up an R&D laboratory. And as we were in the facility, we looked across the little road, and they were building another building, and I asked, what's that? And they said, that's the second R&D facility to go with the second factory. Now, what's the problem with that? There's two problems with that. One is that's R&D that Ford would otherwise probably be doing here. And so we're missing out on those jobs and the technologies that would happen. And secondly, as Mr. Shea alluded to, that technology just doesn't stay within the Ford facility. Those are mostly Chinese scientists and engineers working in that facility, who some of them will take that technology to their joint venture partners. They'll take it to other companies in China and just turn it over, if you will.
And exclude U.S. interest.
Absolutely. The entire goal there is, I believe the entire goal is to fundamentally exclude U.S. company interest and foreign company interest over the next decade.
Right. Are either of you aware of any federal effort to proactively monitor the technology transfer issue as an economic policy matter rather than a national security matter? Dr. Atkinson?
I am not. We have basically haphazard and not very well coordinated efforts. I think this is an issue that the National Intelligence Committee Service group is looking at, as well as DoD, because they see it as critical to our defense and intel interests. But they don't have any systematic a way right now of looking at how bad this problem is, and we certainly don't do it out of the Department of Commerce or USTR. So it's very haphazard. We don't really know what's going on as much as we should.
Shay?
Mr. Chairman, in our 2011 report, I know Ranking Member Tonka asked for some policy solutions. In our 2011 report, we have two recommendations, if I may read them, that may attempt to address this issue. First, we recommend that Congress hold hearings to assess the success of the Strategic and Economic Dialogue and the Joint Committee on Commerce and Trade in addressing Chinese actions to implement its WT commitments, including with regard to the issue of tech transfer. And in preparation for such hearings, Congress should request that the Government Accountability Office prepare an inventory of specific measures agreed to as part of these bilateral discussions. So let's see if these discussions, which are supposed to produce results, are actually producing results, specifically with respect to the issue of tech transfer. The other issue, the other recommendation from our 2000 report is that Congress ask the Government Accountability Office again to undertake an evaluation of investments and operations of U.S. firms in the Chinese market and identify what federally supported R&D is being utilized in such facilities and the extent to which and on what terms such R&D has been shared with Chinese actors in the last 10 years.
Very good. My time's just about expired, but if y'all have any more specific solutions, I don't have time to ask my next question, but we'll go forward. If y'all have any other suggestions or solutions to try to monitor this, I'd appreciate it. Now I'll recognize Mr. Tonka for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Atkinson, you state in your testimony that, and I quote, China is still largely a technologically developing nation, forcing companies from developed nations to transfer their technology, and that is as a faster way to innovation success than engaging in the hard work to move up the technology learning curve, as European and American companies have had to do. In your opinion, why is it that American firms are so quick to give away their technology inherited through generations of innovators and a federal investment when there are so many examples that the Chinese will just use this technology to compete not only in China, but also in other global markets and in America, as in your example of high-speed rail?
Thank you. I think there are two reasons. One is it's not just American firms. In the high-speed rail case, I think, is a classic where Kawasaki transferred high-speed rail technology to the Japanese as a condition of them being able to sell them equipment for the largest high-speed rail system in the world. And then a few years later, the Chinese state-owned enterprise started to outcompete them in third-party markets. So even countries where the firms have a longer-term horizon, they get forced to do this because they're faced with a Hobson's choice. They either do this or they're left out of the market completely. So that's why I think joint action is so important. But I do think the second reason is that American companies are under much shorter time horizon pressures to show returns because of the way our equity markets are structured. And so they oftentimes don't have the ability to, or the patience to say, well, you know what, we're not going to do this because we know in 10 years it's going to be a problem. It's going to help us right now, but in 10 years it's going to be a problem. I think the way equity markets are structured in other countries, that sometimes gives other companies more leeway.
Thank you. And the United States government has invested heavily in promoting electric vehicles. And as you note in your testimony, Dr. Atkinson, the Chinese government precluded the Chevy Volt from qualifying for alternative fuel vehicle subsidies unless GM agreed to transfer their engineering secrets to a joint venture in China. However, GM did not let this deter them from entering this market. They conducted a separate agreement to transfer battery and other electric car technology to a Chinese joint venture. So while I agree that China should be opposed in the policies they are currently pursuing to gain advantage, how can we encourage a new firm culture that would more aggressively protect American ingenuity and innovation And do firms bear no social responsibility for the consequences of their conduct?
Well, what I would worry about is if we somehow said to U.S. companies, you can't transfer any technology under duress to China, and somehow we could pass a rule or a law to that effect. My worry would be that it would just simply give foreign competitors the competitive advantage. I mean, we see this, for example, in the competition between Airbus and Boeing. China is the largest growing aviation passenger market in the world, jet market in the world. And if you're not in that market as either Boeing or Airbus, you're in tough shape. Now, if we were to, for example, say to Boeing, you can't help Comac, their state-owned enterprise. You can't help them. You can't do anything. They're just going to basically say, okay, we're going to get everything, and we'll pressure Airbus. So I think, again, I go back to this. I think that that's where we have to basically go with the Japanese, who are facing this exact same problem, and the Europeans, and we have to all act collectively. Because you're right, Mr. Tonka, it is not in the interest of U.S. companies to do this, but it's very, very hard for them to resist this.
And finally, if either of you could make recommendations from the federal government perspective, and I know that Mr. Shea offered some comments, but are there any within the programs of agencies that we oversee, such as NIST or DOE or NSF or NASA? Is there anything you would recommend in association with those given agencies?
I haven't thought extensively about that, but just a couple of quick thoughts. One, you could require that those agencies who are funding technology projects monitor the use of those technologies and where they end up being commercialized as a first step, which we don't do. So again, it's not to say that I would not put a hard ban on anything. There are real reasons why you might want to go and commercialize something in Canada, for example, but we at least ought to know exactly what's going on with these when we're transferring or helping firms with federally supported R&D help.
Mr. Shea, any thoughts?
Well, NASA was the subject. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory was subject of a major hacking attempt. I would make sure that NASA reported to you whether there was any dissipation of technology as a result of that hacking. One thing that this is not related to those specific agencies, sir, but this antitrust exemption is something that we recommended in 2010. That Congress explore that with respect to the airplane industry. We looked at the offset requirements being imposed on airplane manufacturers to come in. If you want to sell airplanes to China, you got to build facilities here in China. And we thought maybe the major companies should get together and collectively resist these efforts, and that may require an antitrust exemption. So that should be looked at.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now I recognize Dr. Benachek for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, this is really interesting to me, and to see how this works, because obviously these American companies, are doing this voluntarily because they want the business that's available in China. And the thing that Mr. Tonko just talked about, to me, seems to be the crux of the issue, is that if companies want to do this freely, I don't see, why they shouldn't. But if the American people are paying for the technology, shouldn't there be some sort of limit as to, what these private companies can do with the technology if it's somehow associated with a taxpayer investment? I mean, that to me is the crux of the issue. I mean, they wouldn't do business in China unless they thought it was in their best interest to do that. But since some of the funding comes from the government, we touched about it a little bit with Mr. Tonko. Is there some way of doing that it's not completely, you mentioned doing something in Canada, and I can understand that, but is there some way we can do that better without completely closing off that, the good part of the market? You understand my question? I'm just trying to figure that out.
I do. I guess just a couple of points, and then I'll try to provide an answer. I do think that a lot of this is not voluntary. The intellectual property theft, there's certain parts of it where they just take it.
Yeah, okay.
And then there's another component where companies give it, but they essentially have a gun to their head. So it's voluntary.
I mean, they could not do business. I mean, they could just not go there. I mean, they have that option, right? I mean, that's the truth.
It is true, but I think, as I said in my opening statement, they have that option with regard to Zimbabwe, but they don't have. They really don't have it with you know, they could just say we're going to avoid China and Brazil and India, but it essentially, to Mr. Tonka's point, that also consigns them to a long-term competitive disadvantage and perhaps decline, because they're just not in those markets, and their competitors would be in those markets and gain the market share. So I do think that it is worth exploring perhaps some rules about what companies can do if it's clearly federal technology that's been supported, where there's a grant involved for an R&D project. I think it is definitely worth exploring where those can be commercialized and made. One thing I would really strongly encourage to do is, as we move forward, which I hope we do as a country with a trade agreement with Europe, I think that is a very important next step, that we get the Europeans to adopt the same policies with regard to all of their science and technology and framework programs. Again, if we both have the same policies about what our technology can be used for, it's going to be harder for those countries to play us off against each other.
So as I understand, the Chinese don't really prosecute this theft part of it. I mean, the actual people stealing the technology, which we must have, safeguards in that in other countries where an employee is not allowed to do that. But apparently, that's not enforced in China, or that's a problem.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, Congressman. They have great laws. The laws are on the books. They have courts, but they don't enforce the laws effectively. And going back to your question about R&D and taxpayer-funded R&D being used in China and then taken in China, the recommendation that we made in 2011, I think, has been acted upon by Congressman Rohrabacher, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you for doing that. So that might be getting a handle on the problem, getting a handle on the extent of what is being siphoned out. It would be a good first step. I just want to share this issue of competitive pressure and forced technology transfer is kind of you're right, it is voluntary. I mean, no one's forcing you to do business in China, but companies, because it's such a large market, feel compelled. And I had a conversation that still sticks in my memory about 20 years ago. I guess it was 1990. I was part of a group that met with Akio Morita, who is the founder of Sony, a great innovative company at the time. And the one thing that he said that the U.S. did wrong was it had companies had too short a time horizon. And he specifically said this quarterly reporting is a bad thing, because it forces companies to look for short-term profits rather than to have a longer investment timeline. That thought has stuck with me for these many years.
Well, thank you. I'll yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Beneček. Next person I'll recognize is my friend from North Carolina, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Mr. Shea, my questions are along the lines of what you just spoke to, corporate governance issues. I do agree with your testimony. I agree with the premise of this hearing that we should resist the policies of the Chinese government that are harming our economy. They're harming American workers, our ability to take advantage of our own investments and innovation. But I wonder if we are naive to think that the corporations that are subject to this are truly American corporations, that they really do want to resist, that they really are being bullied into doing something contrary to the interests of the American economy, and and they really want to do that. In the last presidential campaign, for all the talk of small business, which I think we should encourage, you would think that we were a nation of yeoman farmers and shopkeepers and artisans, when in fact our economy is being dominated by enormous corporations, increasingly enormous corporations. The Economist ran a piece on that just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And they're not really American corporations. They may be incorporated in Delaware, but they are international. They're international in the scope of their operations. They're international in their ownership. There was a piece this morning or yesterday in a publication, an internet publication called Business Insider by Henry Blodgett that said a theme that I've heard before, that a generation ago, American corporations saw themselves as having a variety of stakeholders, including their own workers, including the communities in which they had operations, including their own country. They were American corporations. And that has now been replaced completely by a philosophy, or at least a stated philosophy, that everything that corporate management did should be in the interest of making more profit. Is it the case that corporations are going to take into account at all the interests of the American economy? Should they? And how do we make that so?
Well, that is a very big statement. I will say, you know, Clyde Prestowitz has written a book on this issue. Which
You've got 2 minutes and 25 seconds to answer that.
Okay. We got the pressures. Corporations are with American corporations are undoubtedly expanding. Their operations are moving on a global basis. I don't think we can expect U.S. companies to ignore 2.5 billion consumers in China and India. So I completely appreciate the desire of U.S. companies to reach out to these markets and to tap into that consumer base. The question is, what about our own productive capacity? What about our own manufacturing capacity? How does that diminish it? And again, our commission looks at the U.S.-China relationship. We don't look at U.S. domestic policies or U.S. corporate governance policies. That's not something that we feel was within our commission's mandate. But I think you raised some very good points. Do the interests of large corporations converge with the interests of the United States government? It used to be said that what's good for GM is good for America. Is that necessarily true today? Again, this is not something that these are not the types of issues that, I'm copping out here, sir, but these are not the issues that the Commission itself looks at. But I think you have raised some valid points that deserve exploration, and there has been some good work on corporate governance issues by people like Prestowitz, by people like Ralph Gomery, and others who have some very strong opinions on these matters.
Yeah, so
Atkinson, yeah.
When I got my PhD in North Carolina back in the 80s, I was involved a lot with the state government.
You're playing to your audience now. It's very
exactly. But I will note one of the things that North Carolina built its economy on after World War II and even through the 80s was the movement of firms from the North, who frankly had no loyalty to the North. They were Michigan companies or Delaware companies or Massachusetts companies. They came down to North Carolina because the business climate was good. We're seeing that same dynamic today all around the world, and I think we can like it or we can not like it. I really don't think there's anything we can do about it. I think fundamentally it's incumbent upon us to do two things. One is to make the U.S. business environment the best in the world, which means in part protecting our multinational companies from these pressures and this extortion that they're facing overseas. But secondly, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world now. The 27th worst R&D tax credit. We haven't funded science and research the way other competitors have. So I think we've got to do much more of that. Just on this point about what the company's interests are, there's a very good book by a finance professor at Northwestern that came out last year called Saving Capitalism from Short-Termism. And his argument is that the role of companies is to maximize shareholder value. The problem is that U.S. companies increasingly maximize short-term shareholder value, not long-term net present value shareholder value. And that's exactly the dynamic we see in China. So I think dealing with corporate governance is important, but I don't think we have to sacrifice or get rid of the notion that companies are there to make a profit. They're just under pressures to make the wrong kind of profit, I would argue, today.
Gentleman's time has expired. I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Rohrbacher, who's not a member of this subcommittee be allowed to ask questions? Hearing no objections, Mr. Rohrbacher, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This issue has a lot of layers to the onion, and we've heard the term extortion of our companies who go there and extortion of our business leaders. I think it's very hard to extort someone who is a willing accomplice. We've had a couple generations now of CEOs who are Ivy League trained, and part of their training isn't being loyal to the United States of America or to the people of the United States. Their Ivy League training, which quite often includes hostile analysis of current history and past history, making the United States look not like the what most of us believe it should be, which is the bastion of liberty and justice and the shining city on the hill that Mr. Reagan used to talk about, but instead that we are at the root cause of much of the world's problems. So we have CEOs who are trained in terms of their history not to be necessarily fans of their own country. And then we have CEOs who seemed also, so they don't feel obligated to do something that's in the best interest of our country. They just don't. There's many of CEOs who don't believe that. But what's even more disturbing, Mr. Chairman, is we have CEOs who don't feel they have to do something in the best interest of their own corporation, much less their own employees. And we have just heard testimony talking about the short-term business decisions by our corporations. Well, those are short-term business decisions made by specific individuals who head those corporations, who may take short-term profit, give themselves bonuses, and get the hell out before the long-term consequences to their own company is being felt, much less the employees of the company. I think we're all in this together as Americans, whether you're talking about employees or employers or we should be. I mean, the world depends on us having a certain dedication to the principles that our founding fathers thought was going to unite Americans. But we don't seem to have it, and I don't believe it's a product of extortion. I think it's a product of people joining on to what I see as an enemy camp, but at least it's a immoral force in this world. Many of the, let me just note, I think we need to restructure our system so that corporate leaders do have long-term interest rather than these short-term quarterly profits that we heard about today. I personally believe, for example, that we should add into our system incentives to promote employee ownership, which would let the employees help pick the CEOs, give them a voting share, make sure they're involved with this whole process, so that in the long run, employees think of themselves as 20 or 30-year employees. CEOs see themselves as 3 to 5 year CEOs. Thus, their notion is not as long-term as their own employees. But back to the basic issue here, how many of these companies that are benefiting from ripping off American technology development and the taxpayers who have paid for much of the development of the technology of these corporations, who the CEOs are going over there and making these sweetheart deals, how many of these companies that are benefiting over there are owned by the People's Liberation Army? I mean, you keep hearing the Chinese corporations buying this and buying that. Are these really fronts for the Chinese military?
I don't know. That's the short answer. But the one thing people in America need to realize that the Chinese government, the Chinese economy is significantly owned by the state. We've estimated that the Chinese economy, 40 to 50% of it, is state-dominated. So that is the issue of transfer, the issue of dual use capability is something that is very important. We last year examined this issue with respect to U.S. support for the development of the Chinese aviation industry. There are a couple of very large Chinese companies aviation companies that want to make competitors to the Airbus and to the 737. And we issued a report, commissioned a research report that talks about the potential application of the technology that gets transferred for military purposes. The Chinese are undergoing a significant military modernization program. They have something called the J-20, a fifth-generation stealth fighter.
I mean, at this point, because my time is running out, let me just note, everything he's saying, Mr. Chairman, is sinful against the United States of America. If we have a potential enemy, I think China is our adversary today, but it certainly has to be put in the potential enemy category. For us to have paid for the research and development that helped our airlines and our aviation and our aerospace industry, for them then to work in joint projects with the Chinese that then give Chinese companies these capabilities, and then we find out, which you will find out, that these Chinese aviation companies are all fronts for the People's Liberation Army. Those are the people who actually own those companies. We will have transferred the equivalent, and by the way, I understand that Boeing was negotiating with the Japanese just 6 months before Pearl Harbor. They were negotiating with selling the Japanese the blueprints for the B-17, which turned out to be the most important bomber of World War II. We need to make sure that our technology is not going to someone who will be killing Americans 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I agree with the gentleman from California. Economic as well as military espionage is a tremendous issue that we face, but that's not the real issue here in this hearing. But I would be very eager to hear, maybe to elucidate even further what you were saying, Ms. Shea and Dr. Atkinson, any further comments on that question. I thank you all for your valuable testimony today. Again, thank you for your flexibility and willing to come back and short-term notice for the cancellation last time and willing to come back for this valuable testimony that you've given to us here today. I know I have many other questions that I will present to you all for written response, and I appreciate a expedited response because it will be included in the official record. I know other members of the committee may have other questions also besides the ones that I have. We need to make sure that we have a way of monitoring this information transfer to these foreign entities, particularly in cases such as Mr. Robach was talking about, that maybe even going to our enemies, both economic enemies as well as military enemies. So I'm eager to hear y'all's suggestions about how we can monitor these things and even develop policies that will help prevent the transfer, particularly of those, the research and development that's funded by our taxpayers to these foreign entities and where they take advantage of our largesse. Members of the subcommittee, y'all have 2 more weeks for additional comments from members and to present questions to these very good witnesses. And I want to thank the members of the subcommittee, since this will be the last hearing of this Congress. I'm not sure who's going to be on this committee in the next Congress. Mr. Tonka, I have had a tremendous pleasure working with you during this Congress as my ranking member, and I appreciate your help. It's been great when we see throughout Congress so much bipartisan, very little bipartisanship and very little mutual interest by members on opposite sides of the aisle. It's been great working with you and working with your staff, and I thank the Democrat staff as well as all the Republican staff for working with me and with us on our side in it's been just a tremendous blessing for me to work with you, Mr. Tonka, and I appreciate your being here in this situation. We'll see what the next Congress offers as far as this committee is concerned, and look forward to where this committee goes, because we have a lot of things, as you know, and the committee knows on both sides, that we've looked at a lot of issues in this Congress that I'm still interested in and want to continue to pursue investigation and oversight of many issues. And this is another one that we just absolutely, I think it's critical for our taxpayers, American citizens, and American businesses that we prevent the transfer of the research and development, particularly that is paid for by U.S. taxpayers, and that other foreign companies benefit from that investment by our taxpayers and then turn around and compete unfairly in a global market. So it's something that I'm going to continue to be interested in. So thank you. I thank you, Mr. Tonka, and
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Tonka, you recognize.
Yes, Mr. Chair, if I might, thank you for the partnership and the sincere desire to build cooperation. Your staff, too, is to be commended for working so well with our team. And I enjoy this committee assignment, and we thank you for the cooperation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Tonka. And in the closing remark, Mr. Miller was the chairman in the last Congress, and I was the ranking member. And I just want to tell you, as you leave Congress, I'm going to miss you being on this committee, and I've enjoyed working with you, Mr. Miller, and I wish you well, and whatever endeavors that you undertake as you go back to North Carolina or whatever you do. And I wish you well and tremendous amount of blessings. And I wish everybody in the committee, staff, as well as committee members, a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. With that, the witness is excused. The hearing is now adjourned, and thank you all very much.